I always hated how quiet the house got when Carla was gone. It wasn't the peaceful kind of silence, the kind you crave after a long day. It was the kind that wrapped itself around your chest, heavy and suffocating. That night, the silence seemed to stretch on forever. It was our 15th wedding anniversary, and I was alone. Carla had texted earlier in the day, saying she was stuck at work and couldn't make it home for dinner. Rain check, she'd written. Love you. I stared at the empty table, the steaks growing cold, the bottle of wine unopened. Rain check. That phrase clanged in my head like an accusation. The thing is, I'd heard it too often lately. Too many missed dinners. Too many late nights at work. I told myself it wasn't a big deal. People get busy. Relationships go through phases. But deep down, I couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that something wasn't right. Carla and I had been together since college. She was magnetic, the kind of woman who lit up every room she walked into. I'd always felt lucky to be with her, even when her sharp tongue and relentless ambition sometimes made me feel like a supporting character in her story. But lately, she'd been different, distant. She barely touched me anymore, barely even looked at me. And when she did, there was something in her eyes I couldn't place, something cold. I didn't want to admit it, but a part of me was afraid of what I might find if I started digging, afraid that the life we'd built, the life I'd poured my soul into, was crumbling beneath my feet. As the clock ticked past midnight, I poured myself a glass of the untouched wine and sat on the couch, staring at the dim glow of the TV. I told myself I was imagining things that I was overthinking like I always did. Carla loved me. She said so all the time, didn't she? Still, that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was slipping away. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of her car pulling into the driveway. She walked through the door, her hair slightly disheveled, her makeup smudged just enough to make my stomach twist. She smiled, kissed me on the cheek, and said she'd had a late meeting. The excuse rolled off her tongue so easily, so casually, that I almost believed it. Almost. For the rest of the day, I tried to shake the unease that clung to me like a second skin. But as I watched her move around the house, her laughter too bright, her touch too fleeting, the whispers in my head grew louder. Something wasn't right, and I was going to find out what. The unease didn't go away. It lingered like a bad taste in my mouth, souring every interaction I had with Carla. I didn't want to believe she was lying to me, but the doubts were persistent, gnawing at the edges of my mind. It wasn't one thing that tipped me off. It was all the little things, the subtle shifts in her behavior. She started spending more time on her phone, always tilting the screen away from me when I walked by. She claimed to be too tired for intimacy most nights, but had no problem getting dressed up for networking dinners or team-building events. One afternoon, I came home early from work. Carla wasn't expecting me, and as I walked through the door, I noticed her purse sitting on the counter. Her phone was inside, buzzing softly. I told myself not to do it. I told myself I should trust her, that I was being paranoid. But something pushed me forward. Her phone didn't have a passcode. It never had. Carla wasn't the type to worry about security. I picked it up and swiped the screen, my hands trembling as I opened her messages. Most of the conversations were mundane. Texts from coworkers, group chats with her girlfriends. But one thread stood out, a string of messages from someone named L. The name alone didn't mean much, but the tone of the messages made my stomach turn. Missed you last night. You looked incredible. When can we meet again? Every word felt like a punch to the gut. I scrolled further, my heart pounding as I pieced together fragments of their conversations. They talked about hotels, about catching up, about how exciting it was to keep things just between us. I dropped the phone like it had burned me, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. This wasn't proof, not yet, but it was enough to confirm my worst fears. Carla came home an hour later, smiling as she walked through the door. She kissed me on the cheek, the same way she always did, and asked about my day. I forced a smile, pretending everything was fine, even as the betrayal churned in my stomach. I ran into an old friend today, she said, her voice breezy. It's so nice to catch up with people you haven't seen in a while. Her words were innocent enough, but the way she said them, the lightness in her tone, made me want to scream. That night, As she slept soundly beside me, I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing. I couldn't confront her, not yet. I needed more than a handful of texts. I needed undeniable proof. And then I needed a plan. The days that followed were a blur of pretense. I went about my life as if nothing had changed, smiling when I was supposed to, laughing at Carla's jokes, pretending I wasn't dying inside every time she looked at her phone. I couldn't let her know I suspected anything. Not yet. Instead, I became an observer, a shadow in my own home. Her routines were the first thing I noticed. She'd always been predictable: work, gym, home. But lately, there were new patterns. Extended hours at the office. Sudden errands that couldn't wait. The phone call she'd taken in the other room. Her voice hushed. Once, she claimed she was meeting a friend for drinks. I offered to drop her off, but she waved me off with a laugh, saying she'd already called a rideshare. I watched from the window as she climbed into the back of a black sedan, my gut twisting with unease. The next morning, I checked her credit card statement. Sure enough, there was a charge for a fancy restaurant downtown. 2 people, not one. Still, I didn't confront her. Instead, I started laying the groundwork. First, I needed tools. It took a few late nights of research, but I eventually settled on what I needed: a small GPS tracker for her car, a voice recorder for her purse, and a discreet camera for our bedroom. When the packages arrived, I felt a pang of guilt as I unpacked them. This wasn't who I was. I'd never been the kind of man to spy on his wife. But then again, I'd never thought she was capable of betraying me. The tracker was easy enough to install. One afternoon, while she was showering, I slipped into the garage and placed it under the driver's seat. The recorder was trickier. I had to wait until she left her purse unattended, a rare occurrence these days. The camera, though, was the hardest, not because of the logistics, but because of what it symbolized. Placing it in our bedroom felt like crossing a line I couldn't uncross. But as I positioned it discreetly on the bookshelf, I reminded myself why I was doing this. I wasn't the one who had broken our trust. Over the next few days, I let the devices do their work. The tracker confirmed what I'd already suspected. She wasn't always where she said she'd be. The voice recorder captured snippets of conversation, fragments of laughter, and once a low, intimate murmur that made my blood run cold. The camera, however, was the final nail in the coffin. One night, I sat in the dark, watching the live feed on my laptop as Carla came home late. She entered the bedroom, phone pressed to her ear, her voice too soft for me to hear. She sat on the edge of the bed, smiling as she slipped off her heels, her body language more relaxed than I'd seen in weeks. Then, she said something into the phone that made her laugh, a soft, intimate laugh I hadn't heard in years. And just like that, I knew. I closed the laptop, my hands trembling. The betrayal wasn't a question anymore. It was a fact, a cold, unshakable truth. But even as the pain threatened to consume me, I forced myself to stay calm. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The morning after my discovery, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, staring at the lights streaming through the window. Carla breezed past me, humming softly to herself, completely unaware of the storm brewing just beneath the surface. "Busy day today?" I asked casually, keeping my tone light. She paused, her hand tightening slightly on the handle of her travel mug. "Just the usual," she said, her voice breezy. "Meetings, deadlines. You know how it is." She kissed me on the cheek, the way she always did, before heading out the door. I watched her leave, my mind already turning over the pieces of my plan. This wasn't going to be a confrontation. Not yet. Carla thrived on control, on spinning narratives to her advantage. If I came at her now, she'd twist the truth, deflect the blame, and somehow make me the villain in my own story. No, I needed to dismantle her lies methodically, piece by piece. I started small, testing the waters. At work, I pulled up her GPS data during my lunch break. Her car was parked in the lot of a boutique hotel downtown, the same one she'd visited twice before. I made a note of the time, knowing it would be useful later. That evening, I checked the voice recorder I'd hidden in her purse. There was nothing definitive, just snippets of casual conversation and the occasional laugh. But her tone, the way her voice softened when she spoke to him, told me everything I needed to know. And then there were the texts. When she left her phone unattended for a brief moment, I skimmed through her messages with L. They were careful, coded in a way that might seem innocent to someone who didn't know what to look for. Miss you. Can't wait until Friday. She'd even saved his number under the name Lauren, a subtle layer of deception that made my stomach turn. But I didn't stop there. Over the next week, I reached out to a private investigator, someone with a reputation for discretion and results. I handed over everything I'd gathered, GPS logs, recorded conversations, screenshots of her messages. He nodded as he flipped through the folder, his expression unreadable. This is a good start, he said, but if you want something airtight, we'll need more. I agreed and gave him the green light to dig deeper. At home, I continued to play my part. I cooked dinner, helped Carla with errands, and even suggested we take a weekend trip together. She declined, of course, claiming she had too much work to do. I smiled and told her I understood, even as the knife in my chest twisted a little deeper. She had no idea that every smile, every laugh, every feigned moment of normalcy was just another thread in the web I was spinning around her. By the end of the week, the investigator delivered his findings. It was worse than I'd imagined. Photos of Carla and Elle at the hotel, their faces lit with the kind of happiness she hadn't shown me in years. A detailed timeline of their meetings, each one aligning perfectly with her excuses. And the final blow, proof that Elle wasn't just a random fling. He was her colleague, a man I'd met briefly at one of her office parties, a man who'd shaken my hand and looked me in the eye. I stared at the photos, my hands trembling with a mix of rage and heartbreak. This wasn't just a betrayal of our marriage. It was a betrayal of everything we'd built together, everything I thought we stood for. But now, I had what I needed. It was time to act. The decision to act wasn't one I made lightly. For days, I wrestled with the idea of revenge, with the implications of what I was about to do. But every time I thought about Carla's laughter, her casual lies, the way she dismantled our life for her own selfish desires, the hesitation melted away. She had to face the consequences, but I wasn't going to do it in a way she could predict. The first step was to let her believe she was still in control. That meant keeping up appearances, being the same husband she thought I'd always been. If she suspected anything, the whole plan would fall apart. So I started laying the bait. One evening, as we sat on the couch watching TV, I casually mentioned a work trip. "I've got to head out to Chicago next weekend," I said, keeping my tone nonchalant. "It's one of those conferences the company sends us to every year. I'll be gone for a couple of days." Carla barely looked up from her phone. "That's fine," she said, her voice light. "I'll probably just catch up on some work while you're gone." I nodded, hiding the grim satisfaction that bubbled beneath the surface. She thought she'd just been handed a free pass, a perfect opportunity to continue her affair without me in the way. Exactly what I wanted her to think. The next step was to ensure I wouldn't actually be in Chicago. Instead, I booked a hotel room a few blocks from the one she and her lover frequented. My investigator and I mapped out every detail, where I'd be, what I'd need, and how I'd execute the final step of my plan. For now, though, it was a waiting game. As the trip approached, Carla's behavior became more erratic. She started texting more often, her smile flashing briefly whenever a new message came in. She even made an offhand comment about how I shouldn't worry about calling her too much while I was gone. "Just enjoy the conference," she said, brushing a hand across my shoulder. "You deserve a break." The irony was almost laughable. When the day of my departure arrived, I kissed her goodbye and walked out the door with my suitcase, waving as I backed out of the driveway. I drove to a nearby parking lot, switched cars, and made my way to the hotel I'd booked under an alias. From there, I waited. The tracker on her car alerted me the moment she left the house. Sure enough, she drove straight to the boutique hotel downtown, parking in the same spot she always used. I watched the tracker as she stayed there for hours, the anger inside me simmering just beneath the surface. But I didn't act, not yet. That evening, as darkness fell, the investigator joined me in the room. He'd brought everything we needed: a laptop, cameras, and a portable printer. Together, we combed through the evidence one last time, ensuring everything was perfect. By the time Carla returned home, I was already gone, quietly slipping back into my life, as if I'd never left. She greeted me the next morning with a kiss, her smile bright and cheerful. "How was the conference?" she asked, pouring me a cup of coffee. "Uneventful," I replied, keeping my voice steady. She had no idea the trap was already set. The house was quiet again, the kind of silence I'd grown used to, but this time it wasn't suffocating. It was the calm before the storm, a moment to steady myself before everything came crashing down. Carla moved through the house as if nothing had changed. She hummed while folding laundry, scrolled through her phone during lunch, and even suggested we go out for dinner that weekend. If she felt any guilt, she hid it well. But I wasn't looking for guilt anymore. I was looking for the right moment to pull the rug out from under her. The following Friday, I decided it was time to make my first move. That morning, Carla was unusually cheerful. She kissed me goodbye on her way out the door, telling me she'd be working late again. "I'll probably grab dinner with a few co-workers," she said, flashing me a quick smile. I nodded, forcing a smile of my own. "Take your time," I said. "I'll be here when you get home." She left without a second glance, her heels clicking against the pavement as she climbed into her car. The tracker pinged less than an hour later. She wasn't at the office. She was heading to the hotel. I didn't follow her. I didn't need to. Instead, I went to her office. The receptionist greeted me with a polite smile, clearly surprised to see me. "Hi, Mr. Walker," she said. "Is Carla expecting you?" "No," I said, keeping my tone casual. "I just thought I'd surprise her. I'll wait in her office if that's okay." The receptionist hesitated but nodded, gesturing toward the hallway. "Go right ahead." Carla's office was neat and orderly, her desk meticulously arranged. I took my time, scanning the framed photos, the neatly stacked papers, the perfectly placed pens. Everything about it screamed control, precision, perfection. But as I opened the drawers, I found the cracks. Hidden beneath a pile of files was a small notebook. The kind of thing she would never leave lying around at home. I flipped it open, my stomach turning as I scanned the pages. Dates, locations, hotel names, and names, one name, over and over again. Ed? My hands shook as I closed the notebook and placed it back where I'd found it. The confirmation was bitter and satisfying all at once. By the time I left her office, the pieces of my plan were falling into place. I made a quick stop at the printer shop, where my investigator had dropped off a file earlier that day. It was all there, photos, messages, even a timeline of her affair. I held the folder in my hands, the weight of it a reminder of everything I was about to destroy. But I didn't feel remorse. I felt resolve. That evening, Carla came home late, her smile a little too bright, her laugh a little too forced. "How was work?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. "Busy," she said, brushing past me. "I'm exhausted." She didn't notice the envelope sitting on the kitchen counter. Not yet, but she would. The envelope sat on the kitchen counter like a time bomb, plain and unassuming, yet heavy with meaning. I had placed it there deliberately, knowing Carla wouldn't be able to ignore it for long. She moved around the house with her usual ease, pouring herself a glass of wine and slipping off her shoes. I could tell she was in a good mood, probably still riding the high from her secret rendezvous. But when she finally noticed the envelope, her movements stilled. "What's this?" she asked, her voice casual, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. "Open it," I said, keeping my tone light. "It's something I've been working on." She hesitated, her fingers lingering on the edge of the paper. There was a moment of stillness, a silent battle in her mind, before she finally slid a nail under the seal and pulled it open. Her face changed as she flipped through the contents. The first photo, a shot of her walking into the hotel with Elle, made her mouth tighten. The second, a candid of them in the hotel bar, laughing like giddy teenagers, made her hands tremble. By the time she reached the printout of their messages, the color had drained from her face. "Where did you get this?" she demanded, her voice sharp and unsteady. I leaned back in my chair, watching her with a calm I didn't quite feel. "That doesn't matter," I said. "What matters is that it's the truth. Your truth." She slammed the envelope onto the counter, her cheeks flushed with anger, or maybe guilt. "You went through my private life," she spat, her tone accusing. "You spied on me like some kind of creep." I raised an eyebrow, refusing to rise to the bait. My private life doesn't seem to exist anymore. Does it, Carla? You made sure of that. She opened her mouth to retort, but stopped, the fight flickering out of her as quickly as it had come. Her shoulders slumped, and for the first time in months, I saw a hint of the woman I used to love, the one who didn't have to hide behind excuses and lies. I didn't mean for this to happen, she said, her voice soft. I've been so unhappy, Floyd. And you. Don't. I cut her off, my voice sharp. Don't blame this on me. You could have talked to me, Carla. You could have told me you were unhappy. But instead, you chose this. Her eyes filled with tears, but I felt no sympathy. Not anymore. Floyd, please, she whispered. We can fix this. We can work through it. I laughed, a bitter sound that echoed in the silence. Work through it? Carla, you've been lying to me for months. You've been lying to everyone. There's nothing left to work through. She reached for my hand, but I pulled away. What are you going to do? She asked, her voice trembling. For the first time, I let a small smile cross my face. You'll see. Her confusion was almost palpable, but I didn't offer any further explanation. Let her wonder. Let her sweat. The envelope was just the beginning. The morning after our confrontation, Carla was quieter than I'd ever seen her. She moved through the house like a ghost, her usual self-assured demeanor replaced with something fragile, almost hollow. She didn't speak to me, didn't try to plead her case or explain further. Maybe she thought she'd already lost, or maybe she was trying to figure out how to regain the upper hand. But the truth was, there was no upper hand left for her to grasp. The envelope had been the first shot, the warning that her secrets weren't safe anymore. Now it was time to dismantle everything else. I started with the finances. Carla had never been involved in managing our money. She left it all to me, content to spend as she pleased while I handled the bills, the investments, the accounts. It was a point of pride for her, I think, that she could trust me to provide without worrying about the details. She wouldn't be so proud now. That morning, I contacted our bank and moved all the funds from our joint account into a private one under my name. I canceled her credit cards, locked down the savings, and even transferred the deed to the house into my sole ownership. By the time she checked her balance, there would be nothing left for her to touch. Next, I turned my attention to her reputation. The folder of evidence I compiled wasn't just for my satisfaction. It was a tool, a weapon to ensure she felt the weight of what she'd done. I sent a carefully curated package to her employer, detailing her affair with her coworker, L. Photos, messages, and timestamps painted a picture they couldn't ignore. I didn't expect them to fire her outright. Corporations rarely acted that swiftly, but the damage was done. Rumors would spread, people would talk, and Carla, who'd always prided herself on her professional image, would feel the sting of her choices every time she walked into the office. Then came the final piece, her social circle. I'd been patient up until now, keeping her friends and family out of it. But Carla had gone too far, and I wasn't about to let her walk away unscathed. That evening, I hosted a dinner at our house, inviting a few of her closest friends and our daughters, Ava and Beth. Carla was visibly uneasy, but she didn't object. She probably thought it was my attempt at reconciliation, a way to mend what was broken. She couldn't have been more wrong. As everyone gathered around the table, I let the conversation flow naturally, waiting for the right moment. Carla was stiff, her laughter forced, her eyes darting to mine as if she could sense the storm brewing. When the meal was over, I stood, raising my glass. I want to thank you all for being here tonight. I began, my voice calm but deliberate. It's important to me that we're honest with each other, especially in difficult times. Carla froze, her fork clattering against her plate. I've recently learned some things about our family that have been challenging, I continued, but I believe in transparency, and I think it's only fair that we all know the truth. I pulled out the folder and set it on the table. I won't go into all the details, I said, looking directly at Carla. But I think it's time everyone here knows the reality of what's been going on. The silence was deafening as I opened the folder, spreading the photos and messages across the table. Carla's friends gasped, their eyes darting from the evidence to her pale, horrified face. Ava and Beth stared in stunned silence, their expressions a mix of confusion and betrayal. Carla tried to speak, but no words came out. I let the moment linger before addressing everyone. "This isn't easy for me," I said, my voice steady. "But it's important that we face this as a family, that we understand the consequences of our actions." Carla pushed back her chair abruptly, her face flushed with anger and humiliation. She stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, one of her friends, her oldest and most loyal, leaned forward, her voice trembling. "Floyd," she said, "how long have you known?" "Long enough," I replied. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of whispered apologies, uncomfortable glances, and hurried goodbyes. By the time everyone left, the house was silent again. Carla didn't come out of the bedroom that night. I didn't care. The morning after the dinner, Carla was nowhere to be found. I wasn't surprised. After the bombshell I dropped the night before, she was probably holed up somewhere trying to figure out how to salvage the wreckage of her life. I made no effort to contact her. Let her stew in it. Let her face the whispers, the judgment, the fallout. By noon, Ava called. Her voice was tight, controlled, masking the anger she clearly felt. "Dad, what the hell happened last night?" I sighed, sitting down at the kitchen table. "You saw the evidence, Ava. Your mom made her choices. All I did was make sure she faced them." "Yeah, but in front of everyone? Did you have to do it like that?" Her words stung more than I cared to admit. "I'm sorry if it hurt you," I said after a pause. "But you deserve to know the truth. Both of you." There was a long silence before she spoke again. "Beth's upset. She doesn't know what to think. And honestly, neither do I." "I get it," I said. "Take the time you need. I couldn't let her keep lying to all of us." She sighed, a mixture of frustration and resignation. "I'll talk to Beth." "But Dad, this is messy." "Messy is an understatement," I muttered after she hung up. Carla finally came home that evening, her face pale and drawn. She didn't look at me as she walked through the door, her movements robotic as she set her purse on the counter and grabbed a glass of water. "Have a nice day?" I asked, the sarcasm slipping out before I could stop it. She shot me a look that could have curdled milk. "You've made your point, Floyd," she said, her voice cold. "I'm not sure I have," I replied, standing. "Because if I had, you wouldn't still be acting like the victim." Her eyes flashed with anger. "You humiliated me," she hissed. "You dragged our daughters into this. You've made it impossible for me to even show my face at work or with my friends. And whose fault is that?" I snapped, my voice rising for the first time. "You think I wanted this? You think I enjoyed watching our life fall apart because of your selfishness?" She opened her mouth to respond but stopped, her shoulders sagging under the weight of the truth. "I didn't mean for it to get this far," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "But it did," I said, my tone softening. "And now we both have to live with the consequences." Over the next few days, the collapse of Carla's carefully curated life became painfully clear. Her employer put her on indefinite leave, pending an internal review. Her closest friends, most of whom had been at the dinner, stopped returning her calls. Even her family, who had always adored her, began asking uncomfortable questions. For a woman who thrived on control and appearances, it was a death by 1,000 cuts. I didn't gloat, though. There was no satisfaction in watching her fall apart. But there was a strange sense of justice. One night, as I was sitting in the living room, she came to me, her face streaked with tears. She knelt on the floor in front of me, clutching my hand like a lifeline. "Floyd," she sobbed, "please. I know I've done horrible things, but I'm begging you. Don't leave me. Don't give up on us." I looked down at her, my heart heavy. "Carla, you already left us," I said quietly. "You left the moment you chose him over everything we built." Her sobs deepened, but I didn't reach out to comfort her. I couldn't. "You need to figure out who you are," I continued. "Because right now you're not the woman I married. And I don't think you've been for a long time." That night, she packed a bag and left. She didn't say where she was going, and I didn't ask. For the first time in weeks, the house felt truly quiet. Not the suffocating silence of betrayal, but the calm after the storm. And for the first time in months, I felt like I could finally breathe. The days following Carla's departure were eerily serene. I'd grown so used to the tension, the lies, the constant weight of betrayal, that her absence felt almost unnatural. For the first time in months, I could sit in my own home and feel at peace. But I wasn't finished yet. Carla had left me with a mess, a broken marriage, strained relationships with our daughters, and a reputation dragged through the mud. I had no intention of letting her walk away unscathed. My revenge wasn't complete, and the final act was the most unconventional. I started by reaching out to Elle. Not directly, but through the investigator who had helped me gather everything. A simple, anonymous message with a link to a private server that contained all the evidence of his affair with Carla. The message wasn't accusatory or threatening. It was an invitation to reflect, to see the life he'd helped unravel. I didn't need to confront him personally. The truth would do the job for me. The next step was public. Not in a humiliating way. No spectacle, no grand announcement, but precise and deliberate. I created a detailed account of Carla's actions, stripped of emotion and written like a case file. Dates, locations, photos. I didn't send it to her friends or family. That wasn't the point. Instead, I sent it to the HR department at her office and the partners at the firm she worked for. Her career had been built on trust and professionalism, and while I didn't expect them to fire her outright, I knew the whispers would start. I knew the respect she'd carefully cultivated over the years would erode, piece by piece, until she was standing on shaky ground with nowhere left to hide. The final act wasn't about her, though. It was about me. For too long, I defined myself by my relationship with Carla, by the life we'd built together, the sacrifices I'd made to keep our family whole. But she had torn that apart, and now it was time for me to rebuild. I sold the house. It wasn't easy. Every corner of it was steeped in memories, both good and bad. But I couldn't move forward while living in the shadows of our shared past. I found a small, modern apartment downtown, close to work and within walking distance of the park. It wasn't much, but it was mine, a clean slate, free of the weight of what had been. Ava and Beth took time to come around. Ava visited first, her curiosity outweighing her lingering frustration. We talked for hours, not about Carla or the divorce, but about life, about her dreams and plans. It felt like the first real conversation we'd had in years. Beth followed a few weeks later, quieter, more hesitant. But as she sat on the couch, flipping through a photo album I'd kept, I saw a flicker of understanding in her eyes. "Dad," she said softly, "I'm sorry for how I acted. I didn't know how to handle all of this." I smiled, squeezing her hand. "Neither did I, Beth. But we'll figure it out. Together." As for Carla, I heard through mutual acquaintances that her life had unraveled further. She lost her job, moved into a small rental across town, and was struggling to keep up with the fallout. I didn't reach out. I didn't need to. My revenge wasn't about watching her suffer. It was about taking back control of my life. And as I sat on my new balcony one evening, watching the city lights flicker against the darkening sky, I felt something I hadn't in a long time: freedom. This wasn't the life I'd planned, but it was a life I could rebuild. A life that was mine. What do you guys think of my story? Share in the comments what you think about the choice I made, and would you do in my situation?